Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 1 minute past 12, so I think we can get started. And I have started the recording for the students who aren't able to attend this session live. Would you please give me a thumbs up or let me know if my screen is showing? Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so in this session, we're going to be looking at Learning Unit 9, Part 1, presented by myself. This is the final learning unit of this module, and it's where the IS and the LM curves we derived in previous learning units come together, along with the labor market, which allows us to derive the Phillips curve or PC curve, and together we form the IS-LM PC model. Once you've worked through this learning unit, you should be able to explain the following in words and by means of a chain of events, equations, as well as diagrams. The relationship between inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment, the Phillips curve and the natural rate of unemployment, and the IS-LM-PC model. In next week's session, I'll present on the adjustment from the short run to the medium run and the impact of fiscal policy. So in this class, which is part 1, we're going to be looking at the short run. And then in part 2, essentially, we're looking at the adjustment from the short run to the medium run and the impact on fiscal policy. This should look familiar to you. So this is the IS-LM model that we derived in Learning Unit 4. Remember, and let me try and use my highlighter here. Okay, so the IS curve is downward sloping, and it shows the relationship between interest rates and the level of output and income, Y, where the goods market is in equilibrium. It tells us that the lower the interest rates, it's generally going to lead to a higher output because cheaper borrowing encourages investment and consumer spending. That's why it is downward sloping. Then we've got the LM curve, which represents financial market equilibrium. The interest rate is controlled by the central bank in our module. That's why it's represented by a horizontal line at the policy rate. The IS-LM model determines the short-run equilibrium position of interest rates and output. Now, in this learning unit, Learning Unit 9, we derive the Phillips curve, which introduces the labor market from Learning Unit 8 into this. Originally, the Phillips curve was derived by A.W. Phillips in 1958, and it showed a negative relationship between the rate of unemployment and inflation. We've got unemployment rate here on the horizontal axis and inflation rate on the vertical axis. That whole thing there. So it's showing that there is some sort of a trade-off. But in the 1960s, particularly in the USA, policymakers attempted to exploit this relationship between inflation and unemployment to reduce unemployment by accepting a higher but moderate inflation rate. They found that the relationship broke down when they tried to abuse it because inflation expectations began to adjust, leading to higher and higher inflation. So high inflation in one year led to higher inflation expectations by wage setters and workers, resulting in still higher inflation the next year, and so on. The trade-off between unemployment and inflation was broken because inflation became more persistent, which kept inflation expectations rising, resulting in still higher inflation, and so the cycle continued. So in other words, inflation expectations that had been anchored and allowed the trade-off between unemployment and inflation had now become de-anchored. So in the 1970s, the USA experienced a phenomenon known as stagflation, stagnation and inflation, which was the stagnation of the growth of the economy, as well as higher unemployment coupled with high inflation. To combat this serious problem of uncontrolled inflation, monetary policy authorities began to target inflation rates, and in the 1990s to keep them under control while still encouraging output growth. Inflation targeting as a monetary policy has been largely effective, and inflation has been stable for a long time. This is why the Phillips curve we use is augmented to capture inflation expectations, and it represents the relationship between the unemployment rate and the change in inflation. So let me show you. Let's first do this activity. What was the key finding of A.W. Phillips's study on the relationship between unemployment and inflation? A positive relationship where high unemployment leads to high inflation. B, a negative relationship where low unemployment is associated with high inflation. C, no relationship between unemployment and inflation. D, a fluctuating relationship that varied unpredictably over time. Okay, I've got an answer from Letabo in the chat. So Gobsby, yes, you are correct. Phillips found that there's a negative relationship where low unemployment is associated with high inflation. So therefore you are correct, and it is option B. Next activity. Why did the original Phillips curve relationship break down in the 70s? A, governments stopped using inflation control policies. B, inflation became more persistent, leading workers and firms to change how they formed expectations. C, the relationship was never valid to begin with. Or D, unemployment rates dropped to zero, making inflation irrelevant. Yes, Gobsy and Letabo, you are both correct again. As inflation kept increasing, it became more persistent, leading workers and firms to change how they formed expectations. And so the correct option is B. Okay, so this is the Phillips curve that I want you to learn. I showed you the original Phillips curve to explain to you what Phillips discovered, how it was essentially abused by policymakers, why it is that we now use inflation targeting, not just as a framework in the USA, but South Africa uses inflation targeting. Most central banks use that because inflation is incredibly harmful. And they realized that the trade-off will break down as soon as workers and price setters adjust their expectations to expect increasing inflation. So that's why we want to target our inflation so that it keeps constant and we're not eroding the value of our money. Okay, so we use this diagram. This is the one that I need you to learn. It is the expectations augmented Phillips curve, or you can just call it the PC curve or the Phillips curve. So it illustrates the relationship between the output gap or unemployment on the horizontal axis and the change in the inflation rate on the vertical axis. Remember before I said to you we're using the change in the inflation rate, not like the original Phillips curve, which just uses the inflation rate. The change in inflation is denoted by current inflation. Current inflation is pi minus the previous period's inflation. So if this year's inflation is 6% and last year's inflation was 2%, it means that the change in inflation is 4%. Make sure that you understand this concept of the change in the inflation rate. The diagram illustrates that when the output gap is zero, meaning that output is at the natural level yn, which is the output level when unemployment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment, then the change in inflation will be zero. Okay, this is where the PC curve intersects the the horizontal axis, which is output. Okay, so at this natural level, the change in inflation is 0, meaning whatever this year's inflation rate is, it's the same as last year's. It's not increasing. Now, that doesn't mean that prices are not increasing, because if this year's inflation is 6% and last year's inflation is 6%, our change in inflation is 0, which means that we are at the natural level of output and income, but prices in general have still increased by 6% since last year. Okay? Does anybody have a question about this concept of the inflation rate versus the change in the inflation rate? You can unmute yourself if you have a question or type it in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I take it that you're all comfortable with the concept of the change in the inflation rate. So we model the Phillips curve as a relationship between the change in inflation and the level of output income instead of the change in inflation and the unemployment rate, so that it can be combined with the ISLM model to create the ISLM-PC model. Remember, of course, that on the horizontal axis of the original Phillips curve, you had unemployment. I'm going to show you how we go from unemployment to level of output and income so that we can join our Phillips curve with the ISLM model that we already developed in previous learning units. Cassandra says, could you please explain that again? I take it you're asking about the change in inflation. You haven't given me any more information than that. Okay, so let's go back to our original Phillips curve so that we can see what that looked like. Okay, Cassandra says yes, it's the change in inflation rate that you want to have explored again. Okay, so in our original Phillips curve, on our vertical axis, we have the inflation rate. Okay, so here's 0% inflation. That means prices did not change. Last year, trying to think of something that costs 100 Rand. Let's just say a basket of goods. Last year, a basket of goods cost you 100 Rand. If our inflation rate is 0%, then this year, that exact same basket of goods is going to cost you 100 Rand. Okay. If our inflation rate is 2%, okay, then the basket of goods that cost you 100 Rand last year is going to cost you 102 Rand this year. If we're in a deflationary cycle and its inflation rate is negative, then the basket of goods that cost you 100 Rand last year is going to cost you 98 Rand this year. Now, deflation sounds like a nice thing, doesn't it, on the surface of it? But I will explain to you in next week's session, I'm not going to get into it now, why a deflationary cycle is actually very harmful to the economy. So that's why our central bank targets inflation at a realistic rate. Our target band is still 3 to 6%. So it's a realistic inflation rate, which doesn't constrict the economy too much. But we also don't want negative inflation or even zero inflation. That does restrict the economy. Okay, so the original Phillips curve had a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. You'll remember that in our augmented Phillips curve, we don't use unemployment, we use the level of output and income. I'll show you just now how we do that. Right now, we're just focusing on this vertical axis to understand why it is that we went from, or what it means that we're going from inflation rate as a percentage to change in inflation. Okay, so you understand my example of if my basket of goods that cost 100 Rand last year This year, if my inflation rate is 0, it's going to cost 100. If it's 2%, it's going to cost 100, oopsie, and 2 Rand. And if it's -2, it's going to cost 98 Rand. Okay? Is that clear? Okay, I've got a thumbs up. Right, I'm seeing lots of thumbs up there. All right, so that is the original Phillips curve. So the policymakers abused this and they said, okay, well, I can deal with, in this example, an inflation rate of 4% if our unemployment rate is going to go from, say, originally it was 5%. Now it's going to go to 2% if we tolerate inflation going up from 0 to 4%. Okay. My basket of goods going from 100 Rand to 104 Rand doesn't seem that bad for such a large decrease in the unemployment rate. So they went ahead and they tried to do that. Problem is that then people started to take a change in inflation into account. They began to expect it. So when the unemployment rate was at 5%, price setters and wage bargaining, labor bargaining would say, okay, well, my basket of goods cost me 100 Rand last year. I think it's going to cost me 100 Rand this year, so I don't need an increase. Okay. But as soon as policymakers started to abuse this relationship, then wage setters and workers discovered, but wait, my basket of goods that cost me 100 Rand last year is now costing me 104 Rand. I need at least a 4% increase in my wages to keep up. So then they ask for at least 4%. Now inflation the next year is 10%. Now they say, okay, well, now I need an increase of 15% because inflation is increasing so quickly. I need to make sure that I can still afford my same basket of goods. And so it continues. And then the inflation expectations became de-anchored. Inflation soared. The economy stagnated. And policymakers had to realize that they couldn't abuse this relationship anymore. And that's what brings us to the expectations augmented Phillips curve, because it is the change in the inflation rate that workers and price setters take into account. Because if inflation last year was 6%, and I expect it to be 6% again this year, the change in inflation is 0, but I'm going to ask for a 6% increase. So the inflation rate is 6%, but the change in inflation is 0, and our economy is anchored at the natural level of output and income. Let's have a look. So when we add the PC curve to the IS-LM model, it adds the inflation dynamics, showing how changes in output and unemployment affect the change in inflation over time. Together, they explain how changes in fiscal policy, like government spending, and monetary policy, like interest rate changes, impact the economy's output and inflation in the short run. But we've gotten ahead of ourselves now. Let's first look at the relationship between inflation, unemployment, and output that allows us to have our Phillips curve associated with output instead of unemployment, which was the original Phillips curve. And now this looks confusing, but just bear with me here. So in learning unit 8, the labor market, we assumed that the expected price level was equal to the actual price level. And under this assumption, wage setting and price setting determined the equilibrium level of unemployment, also called the natural rate of unemployment. So by definition, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate at which the actual price level is equal to the expected price level, and it can be influenced by all the factors that affect wage setting. So the markup, the catch-all variable, the unemployment rate. Okay, so we assumed that actual prices equal expected prices at the point where we have the natural level of unemployment. And equivalently, because now we're looking at prices, if actual prices are equal to expected prices, then actual inflation is equal to expected inflation. So we could just change out these variables. However, we drop this assumption in Learning Unit 9 to derive the Phillips curve. So following from the wage setting relationship in the previous learning unit, we can see that the inflation is positively related to expected inflation, positively related to the markup, and other catch-all variables. This over here. Okay. However, now we're going to drop this assumption that price is equal to expected price. Therefore, we're dropping the assumption that inflation is equal to expected inflation, which means that actual unemployment can be lower than the natural rates of unemployment, it can be higher than the natural rates of unemployment, or it can be equal to the natural rates of unemployment. Okay, so dropping that assumption just means that the actual unemployment rates can differ from the natural rate of unemployment. We assume that inflation expectations are not constant and that past inflation is a good predictor of future inflation. Therefore, the Phillips curve is a relationship between the actual unemployment rate, the natural rates of unemployment, and the change in the inflation rate. The change in the inflation rate depends on the difference between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rates of unemployment. The natural rates of unemployment is the rate of unemployment required to keep the inflation rate constant. So imagine a country where businesses and workers expect prices to be stable at a certain level. In this case, wages and prices are set based on those expectations. When everything is balanced, the economy operates at the natural rate of unemployment. Okay. The level of unemployment that keeps inflation steady, which keeps inflation, past inflation, equal to expected inflation. Now, again, it doesn't mean that it's zero, it just means it's not increasing. It doesn't mean that the inflation rate itself is zero, it just means that the change in the inflation is expected to be zero. Now, let's say that workers and businesses expect prices to rise by 2%, but in reality, they rise by 4%. So because of this unexpected inflation, businesses can afford to hire more workers since wages are lower in real terms than they are expected, and unemployment temporarily falls below the natural rate. However, people will expect inflation to continue rising because past inflation is a good predictor of future inflation. They will demand higher wages next time, and if businesses also anticipate higher costs, they will increase prices further. This results in a cycle where inflation keeps increasing unless unemployment returns to the natural rate. So think of the natural rates of unemployment like the speed limit on a highway. If the cars, or in this case the economy, goes faster than the limit, i.e. unemployment is lower than the natural rate, then there will be overheating or higher inflation. And if the cars go too slowly, say there's higher unemployment than the natural rate, then there's a risk of deflation, falling inflation. So the economy needs to stay at the right speed to keep inflation steady, and that speed is the natural rate of unemployment, which keeps the change in inflation steady. What defines the natural rate of unemployment? Is it the unemployment rate at which actual inflation is greater than expected inflation? Is it the unemployment rate at which wages do not influence price levels? Is it the unemployment rate at which actual inflation equals expected inflation? Or is it the unemployment rate at which the actual unemployment is always lower than expected unemployment? You can unmute yourself if you want to answer verbally. Okay, great. Latabo and Gobsby, you have it right again. The unemployment rate at which actual inflation equals expected inflation. So therefore option C is correct. So in other words, the natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment required to keep the inflation rate constant. Not necessarily zero, but constant. Okay, so we've just established now that the actual unemployment rate can differ from the natural level. And associated with the natural level of employment is the natural level of output, which is the level of output and production when employment is equal to the natural level of employment. As the natural rate of unemployment changes, the natural level of employment and the natural level of output will also change. These three are linked. So the natural level of output is also called potential output. It's the difference between actual output and the potential output. Is called the output gap. It may be positive, negative, or equal to zero. Okay, so earlier I stated that the Phillips curve is a relation between the change in inflation and the level of output and income, instead of saying that it's the change of inflation and the unemployment rate. Again, that's so that it can be combined with the ISLM models to create the ISLM PC model. So how do we do this? We use the observed relationship known as Okun's law. Okun's law states that there is a negative relationship between the level of unemployment and the level of output and income. Since there is a negative relationship between the level of unemployment and the change in inflation, and a negative relationship between the level of unemployment and the level of output and income, there is therefore a positive relationship between output and the change in inflation, which is illustrated by the upward sloping expectations augmented Phillips curve. Let's look at three possible scenarios. If actual unemployment equals the natural rate of unemployment, then output is equal to potential output, and the output gap is zero, which means we are at this point here. Output is equal to the natural level, and inflation is constant because the change in inflation is zero. So that's the only position on this graph that we could be. If the output gap is zero, we are definitely at this point that I've indicated here, where the PC curve crosses the horizontal line of output and our change in inflation is equal to zero. Let's look at the next potential. If actual unemployment is lower than the natural rates of unemployment over here, it means that actual output is higher than the natural level of output. The output gap is positive and inflation is increasing because the change in inflation is positive. So it's anywhere above this horizontal line. It could be anywhere along this point. The actual level of output and income is above the natural level, which means that the actual unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate, and inflation is increasing because the change in inflation is positive. From any point here upwards, the change in inflation is positive, meaning that inflation is increasing. And then our third scenario, if the actual unemployment is higher than the natural rates of unemployment, it means that actual output is lower than our natural level of output. The output gap is negative and inflation is decreasing. It means that we are anywhere below this line, inflation is decreasing, and we are anywhere along here because the actual level of output is below the natural level of output. Do we have any questions before I move on to the next slide? Okay, so the reason, great, I'm seeing lots of thumbs up. The reason why this is important for you to understand the three states that we could be in is because when we combine this PC curve with the ISLM model, we get some interesting results. So let's have a look. See on diagram 9.2 from the learning units, we have a positive output gap, okay? So the actual level of output, Y, is above the natural level of output, denoted by YN, and the change in inflation is positive, i.e. inflation is increasing. If the change in inflation is at the horizontal, i.e. 0, and the change in inflation is 0, it means we have constant inflation. And if the change in inflation is above the horizontal axis, we have an increase in prices. And if the change in inflation is below the horizontal axis, then we have decreasing inflation, which could mean prices are either increasing at a decreasing rate or prices could even be decreasing, known as deflation. Let me preempt a question on that one because as I spoke, I heard how confusing that sentence sounded. Okay, so now we are looking at the change in inflation. We understand that anything above this horizontal axis means prices are increasing, okay? And the higher up we get from this horizontal, the higher they are increasing, okay? Now, say we are at point, let me just make up a random point here, point C, okay? At point C, our level of output is below the natural level of output, okay? And the change in inflation is negative. My negative got messed up. There we go. The change in inflation is negative anywhere from here down. So let us actually use some values to see what this could mean. So assume that at our point C here, our inflation, let's say our inflation last year was 4%. And let's say our current inflation is 2%. Oopsie. 2 minus 4 is 2. Okay, so at point C, our inflation rate is what? Is it 4% or 2%? What would our actual inflation rates at point C be?
It's 2%.
Great, thank you very much for that. Yes, so it's negative 2%. Sorry, 2%, yes, because we've got, yes, it's negative 2%.
It's negative.
Yes, yeah, negative 2%, which means if our basket of goods was costing us 100 Rand last year, it's now costing us 98 Rand this year. So it means that prices are actually decreasing. The inflation rate is negative. But if we're somewhere in between here, say, for example, we're here at point, I don't know, point D, okay? Now, this doesn't change. Our last year's inflation is going to be -4, okay? And this year it could be, let's say, 3. It means that the change in inflation is 1, okay? -1, which means that our basket of goods that cost us 100 Rand last year is now going to cost us 99 Rand. So we're experiencing deflation. And then over here, where the natural level of output and income intersects the horizontal, we have a 0%, which means we know that our last year's inflation was 4. So we need to have this year's inflation as 4 to give us 0. Hang on. See, I've actually just confused myself now. So this is the change in inflation, not the actual inflation. So we're expecting, if we're at 0 in this case, if we're at 0, we're expecting the change in inflation to be 4, which means that our basket of goods that was 100 Rand last year at this point of 0 is now going to cost us 104 Rand this year because our inflation rate is 4. If our basket of goods cost 100 Rand last year, this year at point D, it's going to cost us 103 Rand. At point C, it's going to cost us 102 Rand. And then if we go all the way, if I just extend this line a little bit and make up a point E, for example, where say that we've got -2, I guess we could use -2 minus 4, that's -6. So our basket of goods would actually be 94 Rand now. Okay. Do you see, I actually confused myself with the change in inflation and the inflation rate. So it is a confusing topic, and you need to go over it again and again to make sure that you don't get hung up on the change in the inflation rate and the actual percentage inflation rate that's reported in the news and the inflation rate that our central bank targets. Let me just go over that again, just so that you can hear it clearly, because I got confused halfway through it. Okay, so we know that anywhere above the horizontal line, we have positive inflation. That we can all agree on. So prices are increasing. The change in inflation is increasing. Okay, we can all agree on that. It just depends how far from this point, this 0 point over here, how far you are up this line. That's what determines how much the change in inflation is, and therefore by how much the inflation rate is increasing. At our point 0, it doesn't necessarily mean that our inflation rate is 0. It just means that this year's inflation is the same as last year's inflation. So in our little example here, and I know it's gotten incredibly messy now, but we can say that last year's inflation was 4. That's the example that we've got, 4%. So then this year's inflation rate is 0, is 4, to give us a change in inflation of 0. Okay. But the inflation rate is still 4% at this horizontal, which means that prices are still increasing by 4%, even though the change in the inflation rate is 0. Then as we go further and further down this line, and this is where that original statement comes in, It's if the change in inflation is below this horizontal axis, then inflation is decreasing. Up until this point, we've got our original basket was 100 Rand. If we're at point D, it costs 103 Rand. It means prices are still increasing, but they're increasing at a reduced rate. Okay. Then at our point C, we've got our basket being 102. So again, we've still got a positive inflation rate. In this instance, it's 2 minus 4. So it's, yeah, so it would be -2. So then it would be 2% is our inflation rate. And then over here, it would be -6%, which means that now we're actually in a deflationary cycle. So just because we're below the horizontal line doesn't mean we're in a deflationary cycle, but we could get to one if inflation, the change in inflation keeps decreasing. Have I made that more clear? I'm seeing some thumbs up. Does anyone have a question? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm not hearing anything. So we can see that when output is equal to the natural level of output, that's where the unemployment is equal to the natural level of unemployment, then the change in inflation is 0, and the inflation rate is constant. In our example, it's constant at 4%. So actual inflation is equal to expected inflation. Activity. What will happen to the change in inflation when the actual unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment? Indicate this change on the PC curve. So in an exam type scenario, you would have to indicate what point is the economy at. Is it at the point where it crosses with the horizontal? Is it above that point? Is it below that point? And in that case, is the change in inflation 0? Is it positive? Is it negative?
It's negative.
Yeah. So when the actual unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, it means the output gap is negative, and the actual level of output is lower than the natural level of output. So we're anywhere here. So in an exam type situation or an assignment, you could indicate Y anywhere along here. We haven't given specific numbers, so you can just choose a point. I'm going to go here, oopsie, A, Y, A. Oh my gosh. I don't know how to clear it. Okay, so just deal with my scribbles here. So I've got Y, and it is associated, if we go down to see where it intersects our PC curve, and then where that lines up with our vertical curve, it is associated with a negative change in inflation, which means that the rate of inflation is decreasing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that prices are falling. It just indicates that prices are rising at a slower pace than before, or if we're quite far down, prices are actually decreasing. So if I was going to add some values to this, so let's assume that the inflation rate last year is 6%. Last year, our inflation rate was 6%. It's indicated over there, okay? If we say that now our inflation rate has dropped to 3%, so it's going to be below this line because the change in inflation is going to be -3, -3, 3 minus 6 is -3 over there, okay? But prices are still going up. They're just going up more slowly than before. And for prices to actually fall, the inflation rate would need to turn negative, which is called deflation. Okay, activity. What will happen to the change in inflation when the actual unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment? Indicate this with the change on the PC curve. Where would you put your Y? So, Letabo, I think you mean above YN on the horizontal. So our Y would be here, okay, which is then associated with this point here. Okay, so our level of output and income is above the natural level. There's a positive output gap. And that means that our change in inflation is positive. So prices are increasing at an increasing rate, if I can say it like that. Anywhere above the zero, prices are increasing at an increasing rate. Anywhere below zero, they're either increasing at a decreasing rate or actually decreasing. And then at the 0 point, it's constant, which is why it's associated with the natural level of output and income, as well as the natural rate of unemployment. Does this feel a bit more intuitive to you now? Do you want me to go over anything again? Seeing some thumbs up. Okay. Oh, that was actually our last slide. And we only have 5 minutes left in our session. Okay, is there anything you want to touch on for our next 5 minutes? And remember that in our next session, we're going to be looking at the adjustment from the short run to the medium run and the impact of fiscal policy. Okay, so in the short run, actual prices and actual inflation can deviate from the natural level. In the medium run, because of this adjustment process, it goes back to neutral. Okay, I've got Cassandra in the chat saying, please go over the last activity again. So that would be this one. Let me just erase all of that ink. Okay, so the activity is what will happen to the change in inflation when the actual unemployment rate, which we indicate as U, is lower than the natural level of unemployment, YN. And remember, we used Okun's law to determine that the natural rate of unemployment is associated with the natural level of output, or YN. So we know that is this point over here. Okay, so this point is also synonymous with the point where output unemployment is at its natural level, UN. Okay, and actual unemployment is associated with actual output, for the sake of this graph as well. So another way to read this is what will happen, and remember that there is a difference in the relationship. It goes from negative to positive, okay? So what will happen when the actual output is higher than the natural level of output and income, okay? Because an unemployment rate that is lower than the natural rate of unemployment is associated with an output that is higher than the natural rate of output, which means it's somewhere to this side of the graph associated with a positive change in inflation. Remember, that's how why we used Okune's law to go from unemployment to the level of output and income, because we want to be able to, and this is what we're going to do in the next session, is we're going to combine this PC curve with the IS-LM model. It will look like this, so that we can see what a short run change does and how it adjusts in the medium run. But again, that's getting ahead of ourselves now. That will only be covered in the next session, which I think is on Monday at from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I've got it in my diary. Do we have any more questions? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Thank you everyone for joining the session. I hope you didn't get too confused in the middle bit there where I got myself confused. But that's the thing, we need to familiarize ourselves with these graphs because they are confusing. But once you get the intuition of it, then hopefully that makes the next session, which is where we actually look at the adjustments in the medium term, be easier for you to understand as well. So thank you very much for today's session. Thank you, especially Latabo, Gobsi, and oh, sorry, what is Nombongo? I think you were unmuting yourself as well. It's hard for me to present and also see the names at the same time. But yes, thank you very much for joining us for this session. And I hope to see you all on Monday, where we go through part 2 of this learning unit. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, ma'am.